I'm Danielle Afsorda. I'm the Community Outreach Archivist at the Roberts Library for the Central Arkansas Library System. We're here tonight with Maria Escobar, who's going to speak on navigating El Nuevo South, the geographies of exclusion, inclusion, and safety for Hispanic young adults. Dr. Escobar, so sorry, my little bio disappeared on me. Dr. Escobar is the sociology professor at Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania. She was raised in Northwest Arkansas and graduated from Springdale High School in 2014. A first-generation college graduate, Escobar received her BS in psychology and sociology from Saint Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and an MA and PhD in sociology from the University of California, Merced. Her research and teaching areas of expertise include race and ethnicity, immigration, Latinx sociology, and qualitative methodologies. Really excited to have you here tonight, Dr. Escobar. I also wanted to mention that this is part of a larger series of programs and oral history interviews that we also did for Hispanic Heritage Month, and all of that programming can be found at the link I just shared in the chat, just so folks have that and can just be aware of other things we have going on for Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm gonna go ahead and let Dr. Escobar get started. After she's finished, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. And you're welcome to put questions in the chat as they come to you, and I'll be sure to get them covered once we get to that section. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Danielle, for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm excited to be here with all of you in celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. Before getting started, I wanted to take a minute to talk about my motivation for this research project. As a Latina from Arkansas who was studying sociology of race, ethnicity, and immigration, I didn't always see myself and my community's struggles in Northwest Arkansas, in the US South, represented in the traditional literature on immigration and race that was focusing on the experiences of immigrants and Hispanics in places like California, Texas, Chicago. And so it wasn't until I stumbled upon scholars like Perla Guerrero that I saw an experience resembling my own. And so in this work, I aim to share my community stories, realities, and struggles. And so in that spirit, I included here a picture of one of my favorite taquerias in my hometown. And I also wanted to note that this research is grounded in my experience growing up in Northwest Arkansas, and also my experience navigating white spaces, both in education and also in the workplace. In terms of today's presentation, I'll start off by giving a brief overview of the literature review to help give the context for my research study. I'll then talk a little bit about my research methods, and we will talk about the findings. This is part of a larger project. This work draws from research that I did between 2017 to 2022, and it's still an ongoing project. And I did this work as a PhD student at the University of California, Merced, and it's ongoing. So this work, and so in that work, I talk about the experiences of Hispanic young adults, but also the experiences of Marshallese and Black young adults. But for the purpose of this talk and for the sake of time, I'm focusing on the experiences of Hispanics, but I'm happy to talk about my other findings with you all during the Q&A. I'll end with some concluding remarks and takeaways, and then we'll have the Q&A, which I'm excited about. For this work, I draw from prior research on racialization, illegality in place. Racialization can be defined as this process of devising, changing, and reinforcing racial meanings. That's all to say that we as humans are always attaching racial meanings to others. We're always attaching racial meanings to others based on common narratives that we've heard, that we see on TV, that we hear other people talk about. And this process of racializing people, it has a number of consequences. Hispanics, for example, frequently endure racial discrimination, racial microaggressions, and racial othering because they're often racialized as being threatening, foreign, and as we saw with former US President Donald Trump, as being criminal. Immigration scholarship also discusses illegality as a barrier that disrupts the social integration of Hispanics, both immigrants with a precarious legal status, but also US citizens who might be part of a mixed status family. So maybe they're US citizens, but their parents or an older sibling might be undocumented. And so that's because illegality often acts as the tool to otherize and to exclude. And so that's what we see with this work as well. And because racialization is regionalized and illegality is place sensitive, meaning that that legal status can look differently depending on where you are, as can racial discrimination, racial microaggressions. And because of that, it's important for us also to consider place. And so I think about place and how that can shape and does shape experiences with inclusion, exclusion, and feelings of safety and unsafety. For this work, I operate from the knowledge and this perspective that places are not race neutral. Rather, they're infused with racial meanings. However, places are often assumed to be race neutral, and that's because scholars like George Lipsitz argues that whiteness is an unmarked or normative category, and as such, different white spaces are often assumed to be these normative spaces. But in reality, for non-white groups having to operate and having to navigate white spaces, it's a little bit different. And so that's the work that that scholars like Elijah Anderson and Nilda Flores Gonzalez and my work it touches on. And so Elijah Anderson, throughout his career, but more explicitly in his 2015 article, White Spaces, and then most recently in his book, Black and White Spaces, which I highly recommend for anybody interested in this work, he builds and advances this notion of what he calls the white space. And so Elijah Anderson defines the white space as overwhelmingly white neighborhoods, restaurants, schools, workplaces, churches, or settings in which Black people are typically absent, not expected, marginalized when present, and made to feel unwelcome, a space perceived to be informally off limits, and where they encounter racialized disrespect and other forms of resistance when in these spaces. Nilda Flores Gonzalez also builds on this work in her book, Citizens But Not Americans. And so here in this book, she's also interested in what she calls the racial politics of place, but also in how Hispanics navigate the white space in their education and in open public spaces. And so she defines the white space as predominantly white spaces where Latinos stand out and where physical language such as stairs makes them hypervisible. She argues that the white space conveys racial understandings about who belongs and who is welcomed. And so that's all to say that spatialized whiteness or white spaces are not arbitrarily created. The whiteness of these spaces is a direct result of their racist, exclusionary, and in some cases, violent histories, laws, social structures, practices, and discourse. Open public spaces, as well as institutional settings like our universities, have a history of sometimes being exclusionary or limiting certain people's access to said spaces. The University of Arkansas, for example, was founded in 1878, but it wasn't until 1948 that the university allowed a Black student to enroll. And in college settings, we see what Joe Fagan refers to as a white racial frame. A white racial frame refers to the assumed superiority of whites and the inferiority of non-whites, where whites try to remind other groups of the racial hierarchy through different racialized disrespect, for example, racial microaggressions, colorblind racism. And so we see negative reactions sometimes when non-white groups are in the white space in the form of stares or racial microaggressions. And so that's to say that some white spaces are the result of this restricted access. Some towns, for example, had laws or ordinances that prohibited Black people from owning or renting property or being present after dark. When these laws and ordinances failed or they weren't enough, some white people would form mobs and resort to intimidation and violence to keep their towns white, which scholars have called like sundown towns. And it's worth noting that Northwest Arkansas as a region, the Ozarks more broadly, fall under this definition of a sundown town region. Most recently, towns or places and spaces are also kept white through the use of interpersonal racism, the use of racial epithets, nonverbal language like stares, racial microaggressions, and more subtle forms of racial discrimination. And that's because interpersonal discrimination serves multiple functions. On the individual level, it makes those who are being discriminated against feel out of place, feel uncomfortable, feel excluded. But on the organizational level, it reinforces and it protects the whiteness of a space by keeping people of color out. And so in that sense, interpersonal forms of racism can serve these macro segregationist functions that keep white spaces white. Experiences of inclusion, exclusion, and safety can also and are also affected by a group's social, political, and historical experiences. And so in that respect, I consider these different experiences. For Latinxes, especially those with a precarious legal status or those in a mixed status family, unsafety, for example, might include anti-immigrant policies and practices and other experiences with illegality, as well as racialized experiences as a person of color. And so here we can think about immigration scholarship, particularly Dejanova's work on deportability, or the sense of fear and uncertainty that comes with knowing that you or your loved one is deportable or can be deported at any time. We can also think about concepts like forever foreigners and alien citizens, which highlight that some groups like Asians and Hispanics are racialized as being foreigners, as not belonging, as not being American, which shapes feelings of inclusion, exclusion, and safety. And so because of this presumed foreignness, Hispanics experience and can experience this constrained sense of belonging. Building on Maynai's work on alien citizens, Nilda Flores Gonzalez finds that Latino millennials feel like citizens, but not Americans. Hence the title of her book, Citizens But Not Americans. And so she argues that this exemplifies and that Latinos in this respect, that they have this legal citizenship in some cases, right? They have US citizenship, but they still lack belonging because of different exclusionary experiences that they experience on their day-to-day lives. Such as racial othering, and what she calls the racial politics of place, or how Latino millennials are made to feel out of place in different settings. And so in my work, in my 2021 work, I also think about notions of belonging, and I build on Cecilia Menjivar's work on liminal belonging and Nilda Flores Gonzalez's work that I briefly discussed earlier, and I advance this notion of liminal belonging. And so I argue that for Hispanics, belonging isn't so straightforward. It isn't either you belong or you don't belong, you're excluded. But rather it's this, it's multidimensional, it's dynamic, it's geographically contingent, meaning that you might belong in certain spaces, but not in other spaces. And I argue, and through my work, I argue that Hispanics are often perpetually straddling inclusion and exclusion. And so that's what I mean by this notion of liminal belonging. In this work, I aim to examine how Hispanic young adults in a second-generation Sundown town, which I will explain briefly in the next slide, and a new immigrant destination experience safety, inclusion, and exclusion in open public spaces, but as well as institutional settings like our universities, schools, and our workplaces. And so, as I mentioned before, this study takes place in Northwest Arkansas. The South is often painted as a monolith, especially for people who are not from the South. Following the work of Zandria Robinson and Jennifer Jones, I push back on this. Zandria Robinson argues that the South can be better thought of as a patchwork of Souths, and that we have multiple Souths. In my research, I talk about and I engage with two of these different types of Souths, what some people refer to as new immigrant destinations, and also what James Loewen defines as a second-generation sundown town. Starting in the 80s and 90s, Northwest Arkansas started experiencing a substantial increase in the number of Latin American immigrants who were in part moving to the state for year-long employment at the polleras or the chicken factories. And during this time, immigrants from the Marshall Islands were also moving to Northwest Arkansas. By relocating and making Northwest Arkansas home, putting down their roots, both Hispanic and Marshallese immigrants were permanently changing the racial landscape of some of these towns, most notably Springdale, Arkansas, which has a high population of both Hispanics and Marshallese. And so this is what scholars refer to as new immigrant destinations, regions that saw this significant increase in the number of immigrants. And so we have these new immigrant destinations and these changing racial landscapes that some groups, including Hispanics, are comforted by. However, we still have what James Loewen refers to as second generation sundown towns, which are towns that no longer fit that definition of a sundown town, right? You no longer have ordinances or laws prohibiting the presence of Black people, keeping them from renting homes, apartments, or being able to buy a house. You might no longer have signs posted outside of the city, warning them from being present after dark. However, you still have these persisting, what he calls second generation sundown town problems, predominantly white police departments, predominantly white city councils, for example. And so building on Zandria Robinson's notion of multiple Souths, as well as scholarship on racialization and placemaking, I argue that the US South can be conceptualized as a racialized patchwork of safe and unsafe spaces. So while familiar and ethno-racially diverse places, like new immigrant destinations, can elicit feelings of safety among certain racialized minority groups, unfamiliar and predominantly white places, particularly those with racist, violent and exclusionary histories, can elicit feelings of uncertainty and unsafety. As is the case with Northwest Arkansas, these different regions often neighbor one another, creating this patchwork of presumably safe and unsafe spaces that different groups have to navigate in their day-to-day life, to go to school, to go to work, for leisure, as we'll see in a little bit with my findings. For this work, I draw from a total of 55 interviews that I conducted between 2018 and 2021. These interviews were conducted with people who self-identified as Hispanic, were 18 to 35, had at least one immigrant parent, and have lived in Northwest Arkansas for at least 1 year. In addition to these interviews, I also utilize photo voice. Photo voice is one of several qualitative methods used in community-based participatory research, which has community participants use photography and stories about their photographs to identify and represent issues of importance to them. And so for this research, I asked research participants to photograph or to find online images of different spaces where they felt safe, comfortable, like they belonged, and of spaces and places where they felt unsafe, where they felt excluded. In addition to the interviews and photo voice, I also utilized geographical mapping, where I asked participants to annotate maps of Northwest Arkansas, the state of Arkansas, and the United States to indicate geographically the different spaces where they felt safe and unsafe. For my findings, I divide my findings up into two parts. The first section focuses on place and locational factors. Here, the focus is on open public spaces, and I consider both Hispanics as racialized experiences, but also how experiences with illegality and legal status can shape how safe and how comfortable they feel in open public spaces. The second part of my findings considers institutional settings like universities, K-12 schools, and also briefly the workplace. And so I'll start first by discussing place and locational factors. Through the process of homemaking and putting down their roots, Hispanics were able and are able to feel a sense of belonging, a positive and enduring sense of belonging. Jesus, for example, shared, "I can visit anywhere else, but I feel like this is my home. My people are here. My loved ones are here. This is the first place that I saw when I first got here from Mexico. Over the years, I've traveled to different states, and all I know is that when I'm in state Arkansas, I feel like this is where I belong, and like no one can take me away from here for any purpose or any reason." In these few sentences, Jesus touches on several key aspects of respondents' of Hispanic positive sense of belonging, family, friends, and connection to the region. It's Jesus's family and friends and his attachment to Arkansas that allow him to experience belonging. Jesus was also able to experience belonging because of his sense of sociocultural membership, or his ability to engage in the everyday civic, social, and cultural life that exists and that he has access to regardless of his legal citizenship. Jesus moved to Arkansas when he was 5 years old from Guerrero, Mexico. He graduated from the local school system, attended college, created a community of friends and people who supported him, and made countless memories in the state, all of which helped integrate him into the region and allowed him to form this enduring sense of belonging. Through this process of homemaking, Hispanics were also able to carve out spaces where they felt safe. So Isabel Maria, for one of her photographs of a place or a space where she felt safe, she sent me this photograph of the Welcome to Springdale sign. And so she talked about how she feels safest in Springdale. And so exemplifying this point, I share this quote from Estela. But I wanted to note that most of my participants talked about Springdale, Arkansas. You saw before with Isabel Maria, but also Estela. But most of my participants talked about Springdale, Arkansas as a part of Arkansas where they feel safe and sometimes the safest. Springdale is nearly 40% Hispanic and 7% Marshallese. And so exemplifying this point, Estela shared all the carnicerias and panaderias in Springdale. I feel like being in those spaces, I like being in those spaces because it has foods and smells that are familiar to me. And I don't feel like my mom will be hate crimed for speaking in Spanish or something. They just always felt like a safer space for us just to exist. I don't feel like I have to whisper when speaking in Spanish, and I don't feel like I'll be hate crimed. Like Estela, Hispanics tended to feel the safest in spaces where there were people who were similar to them and where they felt like they could be their authentic selves without being harassed or hate crimed. However, for work, for school, for leisure, to go hiking, respondents had to leave these spaces that they felt were safe, where they were able to build this positive sense of belonging, and they found themselves in spaces that they didn't feel so safe in. They found themselves navigating, again, what I refer to as a racialized patchwork of safe and unsafe spaces. As an avid hiker, Vicente regularly finds himself navigating this racialized patchwork of safe and unsafe spaces. On his way to one of his favorite hiking spots, he passes several rural and small white towns, one of which is quote unquote burned into his memory. He shared, "This place is burned into my memory. Anytime I want to go hiking, I have to drive through this town, Alpena, Arkansas. This is a town where I always say, okay, maybe we shouldn't stop for gas. And this is one of those towns that has the last gas station for a while. So I always have to calculate when to get gas in my head because I always just want to drive past this place. They have Confederate flags flying everywhere. The town even has a liquor store called Sundown Liquors. And I always think I shouldn't stop here." And so here with Vicente's quotes, we see two things, right? We see how Vicente has to navigate these unsafe spaces or these spaces that he perceives as being unsafe. We also see how Vicente, like other Hispanics, use different racialized symbols to distinguish between safe spaces and spaces that might not be safe. And so here he's tuning into racialized symbols like the Confederate flag, the presence of the Confederate flag that are quote unquote flying everywhere. And he also tunes into the word sundown and the name of this liquor store, which reminds him of the region's history as a sundown town region. And all of which makes him feel uncomfortable and unsafe in these spaces that he has to navigate if he wants to go hiking, which is one of his favorite pastimes. In addition to Alpena, Arkansas, Harrison, Arkansas is actually the place that came up the most often during our discussions of safety and unsafety. Every single one of my participants knew of Harrison, which has a history of racial violence and has a reputation of being a racist town. Recognizing this history, Estela Estela shared, it's known as a sundown city. So no, I don't feel safe. I'll drive past it because I have to, but will I ever stay there? No. Panchito also shared that you hear a lot of stories from friends, from family, from coworkers, warning you about Harrison's reputation, and warning you to stay away from Harrison. In addition to the history of Harrison and these different stories, Jenny's feelings about Harrison are most strongly informed by her dad's personal experiences in Harrison. She shared, my dad works in construction. His construction company works mostly within Northwest Arkansas area, but sometimes he gets sent to Missouri and other places, including Harrison. He was telling me 2 or 3 years ago about a time where they were sharing porta potties and a local wrote, "Go back to your country," and the KKK was here. I know the KKK headquarters is there or somewhere around there. I don't know if it was the actual KKK. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I think they were just trying to scare him, but that's enough for me and enough for me to stay away. And so in addition to these different racialized experiences, illegality and legal status also strongly shapes the different spaces, these different open public spaces where Hispanics, especially those with a precarious legal status, whether they're undocumented, have DACA, or are part of a mixed status family, and where it shapes the different spaces where they feel safe and where they feel comfortable. And so Alex, who was undocumented for most of his life until he was able to get DACA, he shared how he feels safest when he's further away from the border. And so for a lot of my respondents, my Hispanic respondents, safe spaces consisted of spaces where there were a lot of Hispanics, where there were people who looked like them, who shared their language. And so that included places like San Diego, California, and Texas, even though they were close to the border, just because there were larger amounts of Hispanics present. But for Alex, those were unsafe spaces because of his legal status. And so Alex shared, you know, that whole stay 100 miles away from the border thing, I definitely try and live by that, even though in reality, it's a little bit further than that. And so Alex, he felt safest in places like Arkansas, rather than places like California and Texas because of its proximity to the US-Mexico border, but also its proximity to border enforcement. And I share here one more quote from Adalia to exemplify this point of US citizens who are part of a mixed status family also living in fear. And so Adalia shared, I think for the rest of my life, I'm always going to have that fear that something could happen to them, that they could be taken, that someone can find out who they are. That has shaped my whole life and will continue to until they're able to receive their documents. Growing up, that's always influenced us. And I think it does for a lot of people. A lot of people live in fear. A lot of people can't even drive to Walmart without feeling scared. And I think that passes on to children. So I think it's a generational thing, living in fear and never being comfortable. And so here Adalia also shows us how seemingly safe spaces like Walmart and seemingly mundane things like driving become unsafe because of her parents' and her family's deportability, meaning that they can be deported at any time and at any place, making all open public spaces and all actions risky for her and her family, and that they could be become entangled in this deportation apparatus. And so now I want to turn our attention to what safety and unsafety looks like in institutional settings, particularly schools, K-12 schools, but also higher education. And then I briefly discuss also the workplace. As part of Photo Voice, I asked my participants again to send me photographs of spaces where they felt safe and unsafe, comfortable, and like they belonged, and places where they felt excluded. And so several of my participants sent me photographs of their schools for this activity. They sent me photographs of their colleges and universities, oftentimes as spaces where they felt unsafe, and photographs of their high schools and school districts as spaces where they felt safe. They often juxtapose these because of their lived experiences in these spaces. Whereas their high schools were racially diverse and places where, to quote Lacey, they felt comfortable and safe and heard by their peers and educators, they experienced what several refer to as culture shock. Once they got to their universities, many of which were and can be defined as predominantly white institutions. They talked about their universities as white spaces where they felt out of place, were tokenized at best, but most often were alienated and excluded by advisors, administrators, professors, and fellow students. And so Lacey shared, I was so used to feeling safe and comfortable and heard by my peers and educators in Springdale Public Schools. Transitioning to my university, I did not think I was going to experience discrimination by my advisor, someone who was supposed to help me. And Lacey talked about how her advisor questioned her intelligence, her right to be at the university, and was trying to steer her towards a quote unquote easier major. Luisa also exemplifies this point. She shared, to be honest, at my university, I never felt included there. There were so many times where in my classes, you know how on the first day of school, professors usually ask us to introduce ourselves to the class. I would say my name, and sometimes they would be like, oh, my international student. And I would think to myself, why would you assume that I am an international student? I am from here. But I would not advocate for myself. I would not say I'm not an international student. I would just stay quiet and let them move on to the next person because I didn't want to bring more attention to myself. Luisa's professor and Lacey's advisor reinscribed higher education as a white institutional space in which Lacey's intelligence and competence as a college student was questioned, and in which Luisa was racialized as foreign and therefore as an international student. Some Hispanic college students, however, were able to carve out safe spaces on campus outside of this larger, more exclusionary college campus. These safe spaces often took the form of the Multicultural Center, or in Jen's case, her Latina sorority. Jen shared, I just feel like accepted. Like I don't have to be working double to be appreciated or to be accepted. You know, I just feel like I'm worthy to be in those spaces and I feel safe in those spaces. As we can see with Jen, safety isn't always talked about in terms of physical harm. Sometimes unsafe spaces are juxtaposed with safe spaces where respondents can relax and where they don't have to be working double to feel accepted and appreciated. And so I want to share one more story with all of you. And this is of Joel and his experiences in the workplace. And Joel's story exemplifies how spatialized whiteness and white spaces are not arbitrarily created, but rather they're being actively created and maintained. During our interview, Joel told me about his coworkers regularly switching up his name with the only other Hispanic employee in the office. To Joel, this conveyed to him that his coworkers didn't even bother to learn his name and that they saw him as interchangeable with the only other Hispanic employee. He shared, those kinds of negative feelings disrupt a lot. They don't make you feel like you belong. These experiences made Joel feel so excluded and out of place that he eventually quit what should have been a great internship and could have helped him establish his career. Joel's story illustrates how spatialized whiteness is not arbitrarily created. Interpersonal racism, racial microaggressions, racial othering, they serve these macro segregationist functions that in which non-white groups, in this case Joel, feel so uncomfortable, so excluded, so othered that he's quite literally pushed out of these white spaces. And so to conclude, in this work, I show that Hispanic young adults navigate what I refer to as this racialized patchwork of safe and unsafe spaces and their everyday lives. This patchwork is informed by the racial composition of a space, by their past experiences or the experiences of family and friends, the presence of immigration or law enforcement, the presence of racialized symbols of exclusion. And we also see this patchwork persist in open public spaces, but also institutional settings like our schools and our workplaces. We also see that places are not race neutral, rather they're racially marked, meaning that they're infused with racial meanings. Public places and spaces that are heavily white and laden with racialized symbols of exclusion, like the Confederate flag, are often coded as places to avoid. Public places and institutional settings in which Hispanics have experienced racial exclusion, racial discrimination, othering, microaggressions, are also often seen as places to avoid and exclusionary spaces. In the realm of higher education, predominantly white institutions are often experienced as unsafe, exclusionary white institutional spaces. But places where Hispanic students can be their authentic selves, speak their native language, not have to work double, to quote Jen, act as safe spaces. This speaks to the importance of us funding funding multicultural centers and creating safe spaces on campus for our students and for them to be able to persist in higher education. To end, I want to note that we're witnessing a moment in which the racial landscape of former predominantly white and rural towns like Springdale, a former Sundown town, are being transformed. The children of Latin American immigrants whose parents immigrated to the US South in the 80s and 90s are choosing to stay and make the South their home through this process of homemaking. And in doing so, are permanently reshaping the racial and socio-political landscape of new immigrant destinations. How safe and comfortable and included they feel in these spaces, however, will continue to depend on how well city leaders address their second generation sundown town issues. At the same time, the futures of Hispanic young adults and Hispanics are shaped not only by this local context, but also by the state and national politics, especially those related to immigration. And so that is all that I have for all of you today. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I've got a few questions, but I'd like to open up the floor to the audience before I ask those prepared questions. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? You can just share it in the chat. Give people a minute. Well, I'll give folks a second to think, but I wanted to ask, as a public historian, I often reach into communities and try to get folks to share their stories, and it can be difficult to get folks to be vulnerable. And from those quotes, it seems like people were pretty open with you. And I wondered sort of how you approached people and what their reactions were to the fact that you were interested in doing this research and learning about their experiences of belonging.
Yeah. In research, we often talk about like how of like this insider outsider status, right? And so how we as researchers can either be like, because of our different identities, we're either like a part of the community that we're researching, or we're these outsiders who are coming in and trying to research a topic. And so I think it helped, especially for my interviews with Hispanic young adults, that I'm myself am a Hispanic young adult from Northwest Arkansas. And like the research questions that I'm asked, like the research question I was asking, like that was informed from my own personal experience. That was grounded in my experience in Northwest Arkansas, but also like navigating white spaces at college and work. And so I think all of that helped. And it was interesting. Like some people, sometimes whenever I'd ask them if I could interview them, they would be nervous. But then we'd have this really great, like 2, sometimes 3-hour conversation. And they would sometimes say, like, I really enjoyed this, like having the space to kind of just talk about my experiences. And so I'm grateful that we were able to create that space where people were able to be vulnerable and share their stories.
And what sorts of questions did you ask? Do you have like maybe a few examples of some of the questions that you?
Yeah, so with my interviews, like we also have like what they call like semi-structured interviews, like open, like, or unstructured interviews, or very like structured interviews. And so I kind of took this middle ground, right? I came in with like a set of questions, but I also asked a lot of follow-up questions, and I allowed participants to take me wherever they wanted to tell me, like with their story. And so I'd always start off with like this really open-ended question of like, can you tell me about your experiences in Arkansas? And so, you know, sometimes they would talk for like 20 minutes and tell me about Arkansas. And then I would just ask follow-up questions from there. I would ask them about, like, especially for my first paper where I was interested in like in belonging, right? Where they felt that they belonged and the different spaces where they felt like they didn't belong.
How did you, because I know like, you know, your field isn't like overly quantitative, but I'm sure you did try to, you know, pull some quantitative data. Like, how did you translate that sort of research, I guess, data set like into something quantitative?
Yeah, so for my work, I actually didn't like pull in too much like quantitative data. Like my university allowed me to make my research purely qualitative, like through interviews. Um, I would say the quantitative data that is there is just like for contextualizing the research, and that's other people's data about like the numbers of like the percentages and numbers of like Hispanics in the state of Arkansas and like new immigrant destinations more broadly. But I didn't engage to, and I didn't have to do that like quantitative data for my work.
Well, since we have the time and people are being quite shy, um, will you discuss a little bit about the expansion of your research into the Marshallese and Black communities?
Yeah, so this project is actually part of so this is actually almost like two projects. So it started off with my master's thesis, which is what my first publication is on. And for that, I was interested in like belonging, how Hispanics experience belonging in Northwest Arkansas, how they experienced exclusion. What was coming up during those interviews were these notions of safety and unsafety. Even in those early interviews, they would talk about Harrison, Arkansas, as this unsafe space. And I wasn't even asking about safety and unsafety during those interviews, during those initial interviews. And so then for my dissertation research, it's an even larger research project, right? And so I was able to build on my master's thesis and explore these notions of safety and unsafety in the US South. Um, and so I also introduced other groups, so we could have this comparative study where I looked at the experiences of Hispanic young adults, but also Marshallese and Black young adults. And yeah, I enjoyed that. Sorry, I'm not able to hear you, Danielle.
I am muted. That would be why I'm muted, so I didn't hum through your hold. That's what I do as a, you know, affirming response. We've got a hand raised. It looks like Izzy Escobar would like to ask a question. Oh, Izzy went away. Izzy, would you still like to ask a question? You can raise your hand again. Got a couple of raised hands. Okay, yes. Okay, I'm gonna allow Izzy to speak. Izzy, are you there?
Are you able to hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. First I just wanted to say that the chat is disabled, so you're not able to ask any questions.
That's good to know. I will see if I can fix that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And then my question was just if Maria is planning on furthering her research in Northwest Arkansas.
Yeah, so I really enjoy doing research with Hispanics, but also because I was expanding to also learning about the experiences of Black and Marshallese young adults. Other ideas were coming up that I hadn't anticipated studying. So for Marshallese respondents, what was also coming up was like the nuclear legacy. And so I thought that was really interesting. And so I think it'd be really great to partner with like a Marshallese local from Northwest Arkansas and continue doing research on Marshallese communities in that respect. With Black young adults, what was coming up in terms of safety and unsafety was often experiences with law enforcement. And so the presence of law enforcement sometimes marked a space as unsafe, similar to what Alex was hitting on with border enforcement. Black young adults were touching on with law enforcement. And then it was also interesting, like the overlap with Marshallese and Hispanics in terms of language. And so how Estela talked about feeling like she couldn't always speak her native language, and how safe spaces were spaces where she could freely speak her language with her mom without feeling like she could be hate crimed. And so for Marshallese, it was a similar experience where they often experience racial discrimination because of their race, but also discrimination because of their language.
Adriana asks, did you interview only second generation? Did you find any difference by immigrant generation in terms of belonging and exclusion? Wonderful research.
Thank you, Adriana. And so I didn't limit it to second generation. I just left it open. I just asked that for them to at least be second generation. So some of them were first generation, or what some researchers distinguish between like first and second, and they make like this middle category and call them like 1.5 generation immigrants, which are people who came to the United States as children or adolescents, and so they were like socialized in the United States, and so they have different experiences than like adults who immigrated to the country. But yeah, I definitely saw differences in terms of belonging and exclusion, legal status, and like this like illegality and this notion of like deportability, and so feeling unsafe. And this really strong sense of exclusion from the country because you're deportable and can be excluded and can be deported at any time was a lot stronger for people who had this precarious legal status, whether they were undocumented or for people who had temporary protective status. That also came up. And then also though for US citizens, so people who were born in the United States, but maybe their parents are undocumented, or they have an older sibling who is undocumented. And so they fear one of their loved ones becoming entangled in this deportation apparatus, and then family separation because of that.
Jessica asks, can you talk about your personal experience living in Northwest Arkansas as a Latina? Did you experience discrimination?
So for me, it was actually really interesting. So because I mostly stayed within like Northwest Arkansas, and Springdale, Arkansas, which has a high percentage of Marshallese and Hispanics. It wasn't until I left that and went to college in this very predominantly white town that I experienced like this white space, both on campus, but in like the town that the college was located in. And so that's where I really tuned into like the importance of place. And so that's kind of where like my more racialized experiences took place.
And Adriana asks, did you find differences by gender in your research?
And so I also was not like from the start looking for differences by gender. I will say that came up a lot more often with the second part of my research, where I was looking at safety and unsafety. And I think that's because like being a woman, that comes with like different unsafe experiences. And so like gas stations, for example, came up for women of like Marshallese women, Hispanic women, and Black women, like being isolated at a gas station and like people coming up to you. And so that came up as like this unsafe space. And so it wasn't only gas station, but it was also like nighttime that came up. And so I saw differences by gender in that respect. Also with unsafety, I saw differences in terms of safe and unsafe spaces by like sexuality. So like gay and queer people, again, across the different racial groups that I was studying, expressing how maybe their like Black counterparts who were straight could experience a certain space as safe, but for them, because they were like, for example, like a gay Black man, certain spaces that were safe for their straight counterparts were safe, but not for them.
That's really fascinating. Seth asks, did participants reveal safety concerns in healthcare settings? Is that something you explored?
So I didn't explore that either. It came up, but only one time, and that was with a healthcare provider. But in future work, I'd definitely be interested in looking at this a little bit further, because it's really important, right? Looking at access to doctors and to different healthcare settings. But it did come up with one healthcare provider, and he talked about how his different Hispanic patients were sometimes weary of making appointments, not only at his office, but other people's office as well, because they were afraid of giving their personal information, and just like what can happen with that personal information. And so I can recommend other research, Seth, if you're interested in this. One of the professors at my university, UC Merced, that I was at as a graduate student, she looks at how different undocumented immigrants and those with a precarious legal status, how their access to healthcare settings is kind of strained because of their legal status.
And Jessica asks, did your research make you look at your hometown in a different way? If so, how, in what way?
Well, it made me appreciate my hometown in terms of like its inclusionary aspects and this ability of people to engage in this process of homemaking. However, thinking about like, we weren't taught like in my high school, we weren't taught about this history of Arkansas, right? Of Northwest Arkansas, of the Ozarks more broadly being like a sundown town region. And so it wasn't until I started doing research about Northwest Arkansas that I learned that it was a sundown town region. And so definitely made me look at my hometown differently in that respect. For example, like Springdale, we say it's racially diverse because there's a high percentage of Hispanics and Marshallese. However, because it was a former sundown town, it had a sign like outside of its city limits warning Blacks from being present after dark. It's still there's still not a lot of Black people. I think it's like 3% of the population. And so it's still has a very small amount of Black people in Springdale, Arkansas, a place like Harrison. And so it did make me look differently at that. Also considering like second generation sundown town problems. And so looking at our city council, right? And so in Springdale, the city council does not reflect the people that it's representing. And so thinking about issues like that as well.
Adriana would like to know if you've published your research.
I published my my master's thesis where I was looking at belonging and exclusion. I can share that with any of you. So I'll put my email in the chat, but if you email me, I can share that article with all of you to get around the paywall.
We love an academic paywall jump, thanks. Also, if you attend, like, if you have access to like a university email, it's available through, I think, EBSCO. That's how I accessed it before our talk. So that's also one way to get to it without paying for single use. Or and another question. After your research and seeing the importance in creating a safe space for your students, how do you create a comfortable environment?
So, I mean, now it's interesting now being like a professor on a college campus, like being able to create a safe space within my classroom. That's what I have the most power in. And so always trying to help foster the sense of belonging in my students. Forming like relationships between students and their professors are really important for them to feel the sense of belonging. So even if they feel kind of excluded from campus, if they feel like they have a relationship with a professor or with somebody at the university, that can make a difference in like their persistence at a college. So I always try to form meaningful relationships with my students. If they're struggling, you know, I try to remind them that college is tough, right? Like reading sometimes, like readings can be tough. And so I meet with them and I try to remind them, right, rather than like otherizing them and trying to make them feel like they don't belong on a college campus, I do the opposite. And I try to normalize the difficulties of college and make them realize that like college is for them. Maybe it wasn't built for them, right? The University of Arkansas wasn't built for us, but we're able to create like safe spaces within their safe space or in places where we feel like we belonged.
And Izzy asks, what are you hoping you will achieve or have achieved with the research?
Well, I think one, sharing our story The publication process is it's a very long process. It took me like, I started this work in 2017 and that article was published in 2021. And so it's a long process, doing the interviews, doing that literature review where you're like synthesizing other work, writing up your findings, and then just editing over and over and over again until it's finally to that published process. But for me, what kept me motivated was like, these people gave me their time, they shared their stories, like we shared, like they were vulnerable with me. And so I have to get this published and get their story out there as well.
I also noticed, this is just something I thought of. I don't see another question at this moment. I noticed you used first names. Was that a safety thing, just wanting to protect people's identities?
And that's not even their real names. So those are all pseudonyms.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, like in sociology, we're strongly discouraged from using like real names. I know like for oral histories, like the names are preserved. And like sometimes it's like videos as well, which I think is really strong. But in sociology, we use pseudonyms. And so these false names to protect their identity, which I think is especially important for like people who are sharing about their legal status, who are undocumented and are already afraid because of their precarious legal status.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And I think, thinking about how our fields, like, I feel like I look at sociology stuff, you probably look at history stuff, like there's a lot of, we're both in the social sciences. And so I think that there's kind of this beauty in the fact that like the methodology of your research protects people and you still get to capture these stories that like I probably won't get to capture in my work. And I think that that's really wonderful and that you get to share that. So yeah, thank you for doing it. Maria put her email in the chat, and I'm also going to share, I just found two of the resources that she mentioned in her talk. And both of these are just the publisher websites. If you're CALS card holders, I looked, these aren't in our catalog, but we have this lovely tool called Mobius where you can request books and pick them up at a CALS location, public library talking. So if people on the call are CALS card holders, that's a good way to do it. If you're not, your public library probably has interlibrary loan. We don't want money to be a reason people don't interact with this awesome research. So does anyone have any other questions before we close? I'm sorry again about the chat issue. I'm glad that everyone got an opportunity to share their questions in the time. I was thinking it was surprisingly quiet. I was like, this was really interesting. Where are the questions? I broke the Zoom. That's my problem. I did want to mention a couple of things that we have coming up at the Butler Center. If folks are local to Little Rock, we have a genealogy conference that will be Saturday from 9:30 to 3:30. You can look at our website, robertslibrary.org. I think I have a link actually I can share real quick if people are interested in that. It's both virtual and in person. And I also wanted to share about the Memory Lab. If you want to preserve stories from your families, we have a public digitization lab where you can digitize audiovisual or regular print media at a scanning station. I'm just going to share information about that. And we also have oral history toolkits if you want to record oral histories with your family members. So these are all things I just like to make sure that I share so folks know about the resources at Roberts. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Dr. Escobar. This was really amazing and I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle, for reaching out and for the invitation and for hosting this, especially for Hispanic Heritage Month. You said this is the second time.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Everyone have a good night. Bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye.